Imagine this. You're back in school. Your teacher's explaining something and maybe you're not very persuaded. You ask your teacher a question. And the teacher gives you an answer and maybe the other people in the class are convinced by that answer, but you're not, so you ask again. And maybe the teacher gives the same answer, or maybe the teacher gives the exact same words from the exact same textbook. And maybe you're not convinced, and you think about that. And you realize, you learn something more important than anything else you could have learned in that class. You've learned, as we all learn at some point, that the teacher is just some person. Just some person who's following along from the textbook. And then you think, well, if I can't trust all these old books and all these people with letters after their name, then how am I to know anything? Well, maybe I trust myself. But how do I even know if I can trust myself? I mean, I've had the occasion where I've woken up and gone about my day and then I've woken up again. Because that first time after I'd woken up, I wasn't really awake. I was really dreaming. And that's happened to you. And so, how do you know whether you're even awake right now? How do you know anything with any certainty? These were the questions which were asked by the philosopher René Descartes. I'm going to explain his philosophy across two of his books, the Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy. I'm going to talk about these two different books together because they make similar and overlapping arguments. First, I'm going to start with some historical background. If you learn about the history of philosophy in Europe, you're going to start with the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. You're going to learn about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and maybe you learn about the Stoics, and then there's a gap of 500 years. And then you learn about the modern philosophers, René Descartes. René Descartes is considered to be the father of modern Western philosophy. And you learn about the other modern philosophers like Hume and Kant and Locke. Then you wonder, well, what happened in those intervening 1500 years? Well, what happened was there was philosophy then. There were many philosophers, but the philosophers at that time were not trying to figure things out from first principles. They were building on top of the existing knowledge, the existing received wisdom, the existing authority. And there were two sources of authority that you do not question. One of them was the philosopher Aristotle, and another one was the Bible. But by the 1500s, things start to change. So first of all, for a long period of time, there was no point running an experiment. I mean, we have all this received wisdom from Aristotle. We can deduce other things based on what Aristotle said. Aristotle said that heavy things fall faster than light things. And he said that, and so you don't need to test it. But then it was put to the test. It was put to the test, among others, by the scientist Galileo. And Galileo found that Aristotle was wrong, demonstrably wrong. And this is also the same time in the 1500s that we have the development of the printing press in Europe. And now you're able to read the Bible in your own language. And you have a lot of different theological ideas from the church, their interpretation of the biblical text. But then people start reading it, they start reading it in their own language, and they think, wait a second, there are other ways to interpret the text. And so people start questioning authority. You have the Reformation against the Catholic Church by the Protestants, and then you have the Counter-Reformation by the Catholic Church against the Protestants. And this is the intellectual climate in which Descartes is living. Descartes is born in 1796, and he's living and philosophizing in the early 1600s. Born into a wealthy family in France, he goes to a Jesuit college where he's learning about the Bible and Aristotle, the received wisdom at the time, the authority that you don't question. And Descartes is very much unimpressed and very frustrated with the lack of the progress in the development of knowledge. If you look at medical science, Descartes was very interested in medicine. He was performing autopsies and reporting on them. Well, the medical science they had was the same medical science they had 1500 years ago from the Roman physician Galen. And so medical science hadn't improved in 1500 years. Descartes, what he wants to do is he wants to improve people's understanding of the world. But as far as he's concerned, we've got all these old books and old texts, and you're not learning from them. The only thing that happens when you go to school, when you go to college, and you learn from the ancient wisdom, it doesn't teach you to think. All it does is narrow down your thinking to prevent you from thinking for yourself. And so what Descartes decides to do is he decides that he's going to reject the existing authority, and he is going to start over again to find out what he can know from certainty. There is one area where he can know things with certainty, and that's mathematics. Even if Descartes had not been a philosopher, he would still be a very famous and influential mathematician. He was the person who invented Cartesian coordinate geometry. That's where you visualize space in terms of an x and a y axis. He was the person who combined geometry with algebra. He found that every equation you have, you can visualize as a line. Also, he actually invented the sign for power. So when you say x squared with a little 2, he invented that. Here's an example of something that we know, that Descartes says we know from math with absolute certainty. And this is the kind of knowledge he wants. We know with absolute certainty, according to Descartes, that that the angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles. So a right angle is 90 degrees, a triangle has 180 degrees. How do we know that? We know that logically. We know it from deduction. So Descartes is focusing on deductive logic. If we know A and B, we can work out C. So we have a rectangle. We have a rectangle, and a rectangle has 4 right angles. How would you get a triangle? You take the rectangle, you cut it in half, you throw one half away, now we've got a triangle. So a triangle is really half a rectangle. A rectangle has 4 right angles, triangle is half, therefore it has 2 right angles. That is logically, deductively true. It needs to be true. It's true by definition. And so what Descartes wants to do is he wants to get rid of, destroy all the existing knowledge, so-called knowledge, and begin again with absolute certainty in the style of mathematical reasoning. And so when you're reading his book, The Meditations on First Philosophy, it's almost as if you're in the mind of someone who is writhing in their sleep, desperately trying to wake themselves up. At this point, I need to talk about the different ways you can get knowledge. So the philosophy, the philosophical field of how you get knowledge is called epistemology. Epistemology means the ways in which you know things. And I'm simplifying here. There are 3 ways to know things, 3 sources of knowledge. One of them is authority. This is true because it said it in an old book. This is true because the person who said it wore a toga. This is true because the person who said it wore a crown. Descartes rejects that. Not impressed. Well, there's 2 other remaining sources of knowledge. One of them is from the senses. That I know about the world because of the light that comes into my mind, the light that comes into my eyes, the sound that comes into my ears, and all this tactile sensation that I get from my skin. That you learn about the world from your senses. This is called empiricism. Empiricism says you learn about the world from your senses. Descartes rejects empiricism. What Descartes is doing is he's rejecting anything he can't be certain of. Maybe you're very sure about something, maybe you have a lot of belief in something. That is not sufficient for Descartes. He wants absolute certainty. There are times when your senses can trick you. I have my hand here. I'm looking at it. It looks big. Now it looks kind of middle-sized. Now it looks small as it's moving away. If I were to trust my eyes, then I think that my hand was changing size. Descartes says, as he was travelling around Europe, there were occasions where he saw towers that appeared to be round, but when he got closer, actually turned out to be square. There are times when your senses can trick you. He says, let's imagine you have a piece of wax. The piece of wax has all of these properties, things about the wax that you learn from your senses. It has a shape, and it has a temperature, and it has a smell, and it has a feeling when you touch it. Let's imagine you take the wax and you melt it. And all of its properties change. Its temperature changes, and its smell changes, and it changes shape, and it changes what it feels like when you touch it. All of its properties change, and yet you know it's the same wax. How do you know that? I mean, you need to know it some way, but you don't know it because of your senses. Because all the sensory input is different, even though you know it's the same wax. Can't trust your senses. And so, because there are times when your senses can trick you, he rejects empiricism. Then there's the third way we can get knowledge, which is from reason. This is called rationalism. Descartes is remembered as a leading rationalist philosopher, but at the very beginning he rejects rationalism. There are times when your reasoning can trick you, or at least it's possible that your reasoning could trick you. So every time I think something that seems obvious, like 2 plus 3 equals 5, maybe every time I do that I'm making a mathematical mistake. Using the religious language of the time, Descartes says, well, maybe I'm being tricked by a demon. Or to use a modern example, maybe every single time I work it out, there's an error in all of these different algorithms that I'm using to work it out. So your reasoning can trick you. Your thoughts can clearly be wrong. I'm perceiving all of these things around me, but I also perceive things around me when I'm dreaming. So how do you know that you're not dreaming? And so he says that you cannot get knowledge from these different sources. He doubts authority. He doubts his senses. He doubts his reason. But there's one thing he finds he cannot doubt, one thing that he knows. One thing that he knows as a self-evident truth, and that is that he, Descartes, is doubting things. And this is remembered in the famous quote from the book, I think, therefore I am. Descartes knows that he's thinking. Descartes proves the existence of Descartes. I think, therefore I am. I'm going to spend a moment discussing the exact phrasing of that quotation. The way it's phrased, I think, therefore I am, implies it's a deductive argument. A, therefore we can deduce B. But that's not exactly what he means by that. When Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, he's not saying it's true in the sense of a logical argument. He's saying that it's true as a self-evident statement. It's not, I think, therefore I am. It's more like, I think, I am. It's almost like a revealed truth, a revelation that he cannot reject. It's an intuition. It's an intuition. Intuition is a big part of his philosophy. He says it is the result of the natural light of reason. And at this point we've got to the end of the second of 6 chapters of his book, Meditations on First Philosophy. Normally this is where the discussion of Descartes finishes. This is normally where people get up to when they stop talking about Descartes. But it's important to carry on to explain what Descartes is discussing throughout the rest of the book in order to understand and weigh up his argument. So what Descartes has said so far is he knows his mind exists. Now, he's not yet proven that matter exists. He's not yet proven that he has a body, that he exists in space with arms and legs and hands and feet. So when he says I, the I refers to his immaterial mind. When Descartes says I, it means his immaterial mind. Descartes later uses this to prove that his mind is separate from his body, which is the position called substance dualism, mind and body, different substances. What is surprising, at least to modern readers, is what Descartes does next. The next thing that Descartes does in the Meditations is he seeks to prove the existence of God. And he has a reason for this. The reason for this is that so far he's received this intuition, I think I am. That's what he's received so far. And maybe he's right about that, and maybe he's wrong about that, and maybe he's wrong about 2 + 3 = 5. How does he know anything? If there is a God, it means that Descartes has received that intuition, I think I am. He's received that idea from God, and also that the idea is true, because God is a perfect being and God does not lie. So the idea is, if God exists, God gives Descartes his intuition, and therefore Descartes can trust his intuitions with certainty. And so this I think I am assumes the existence of God. Descartes makes a few different arguments from the existence of God, but there are two different types of argument. The first type of argument is based upon perfection. And there's 3 of these arguments which I'll summarize here. The first one is that Descartes says, I doubt. I know I'm doubting. Doubting is less perfect than knowing. How do I know what knowing is, even though I just doubt? I must know about knowing, which is more perfect than doubting, because I received that idea from a more perfect being. That more perfect being is God, therefore God exists. The second version of this argument is that I, Descartes, am limited. I can make mistakes. I, Descartes, am certainly not all-powerful. I'm limited. I'm imperfect. And yet I know that I'm imperfect. How do I know that? Well, you know that something is small to the degree that it's next to something that's bigger. I know I'm imperfect because I must have the idea of perfection. You can only get the idea of perfection from something which is more perfect. Therefore, I know I'm imperfect. I have the idea of perfection because I have received the idea of perfection from a more perfect being, which is God, therefore God exists. His third argument about perfection is that everything which exists is created by something which is more perfect. Here's an example. This is not the example Descartes uses, but nevertheless I believe this to be an illustrative example. Imagine a watchmaker. A watchmaker makes a watch. Now the watch is a watch, but the watchmaker is able to make the watch and presumably is able to make other things, and if the watch breaks is able to fix it. The watchmaker is more powerful, more complicated, more perfect than the watch which is made. If something is made, it is made by something which is more perfect. Everything that exists because it's made by something more perfect. If my mind exists, it must exist because it's made by something more perfect. That more perfect thing is God. Therefore God exists. So those are Descartes' arguments about the existence of God, which are based upon perfection. His second argument about the existence of God is based on the very idea of God. Descartes says, I have this intuition that there's a God. Where do I get the idea that there's a God? Well, God is an infinite being, but I'm a finite being. I can't come up with the idea of God myself. How could I possibly come up with the idea of God myself? How could I, in my feeble human mind, come up with such a perfect idea? I must have received the perfect idea of God from a perfect being, which is God. And so Descartes says, because he has the idea of God, there must be a God. And so now Descartes, as far as he's concerned, has proven the existence of God. From that, what it then means is that Descartes can trust his intuitions, this natural light of reason that he's talking about. Well, now he knows that God exists, therefore he can trust his intuition, because God gives him these intuitions, and God, being a perfect being, is not a deceiver. If God gives Descartes an idea, either the idea is true, or it's an idea that God has given Descartes the ability to figure out. Another intuition which Descartes has is the intuition that he has a body separate from his mind. Descartes has the intuition that he has a physical body which is extended in physical space. Therefore, Descartes knows he has a body. Actually, Descartes says that this intuition also tells him that his mind and his body are two different things, such that his mind is not dependent on his body. So if you have no body, if your body doesn't exist, your mind would still be the same. If Descartes didn't have a body, he would still be able to have ideas, he would still be able to reason, he would still be able to make judgments about what's true and false. None of that is contingent upon the body. And therefore, because the body exists, because of this intuition, but the mind doesn't depend on the body, therefore the mind and the body are two different things. This is called substance dualism. They're two categorically different substances. Descartes says that another proof that the mind and the body are different things is that the mind is indivisible. You have one mind, it can't be split into different parts, but your body can clearly be split into different parts. If someone has an amputation, then has their leg removed, the rest of their body works just fine. So your body can be split, your mind can't, therefore they have different properties. Mind and body have different properties, and therefore mind and body are categorically distinct, separate things. And then, because he has this idea that God exists and therefore he can trust his intuitions, Descartes also says, I can trust all of my intuitions about mathematics and about triangles. I can trust that 2 plus 3 is equal to 5, because when I think of that, God isn't going to trick me. Now, it is the case that Descartes can be tricked by his senses. We all can. But it's also the case that Descartes receives clear and distinct intuitions. So, an intuition, something which you know to be true, that seems self-evident. Descartes says we know that's true. He refers to it as a clear and distinct idea. And one of these clear and distinct ideas is that some objects can help or can hurt you. If you have a very dry mouth, for example, after giving a lecture, then you can get a clear and distinct idea. Maybe it would help me to drink this water. You don't know about the properties of physical objects. I don't know anything about the water bottle. I don't know its shape, I don't know its size, I don't know its temperature. But what I do know, clearly and distinctly in my mind, is that when I feel thirsty, my mind tells me that water bottle is good for me. And also if I put my hand toward a fire, I don't know anything about the properties of fire. I don't know anything about chemistry, but what I do know, what I receive as a self-evident truth, is that I should move my hand away from the fire because that would hurt me. And therefore, because I get that self-evident idea about whether this object can help or hurt me, I know whether that object exists. And therefore, your intuition can tell you whether objects exist to the degree that they are helpful or harmful. It's a very limited kind of empiricism. But Descartes has not yet determined whether he is awake. Descartes is writing the Meditations. He is writing it with a quill, and he is writing it by candlelight, and he is doing it night after night. And you could imagine that if he is doing it night after night, writing by candlelight, then he might start dreaming that he's writing by candlelight. And so if Descartes finds himself in a situation where he perceives himself to be writing by candlelight, maybe it's real or maybe it's just a dream. How would you know? At this point, and this is at the very end of the book, it's important to talk about another difference between the mind and the body. You see, the mind can have conceptions, it can have ideas such as definitions. The mind can have the idea a triangle is a closed shape with straight lines and 3 angles. So your mind can have the definition of the thing. But if you want to imagine the thing, to picture it in your mind, then you need the work of both your mind and your body. Because what your body is doing is it's taking in information from your senses. And then when you're imagining something, you're thinking of a triangle as if you were seeing it with your eyes. And so you're thinking of it with your mind as if it was one of your senses from your body. So mind and body work together to produce imagination. Now, the difference between being awake and being asleep is that if you're awake, then these perceptions and these imaginings and these ideas you have are consistent. You write one line of the meditation, then you write another, and you look at the candle, and over time the candle kind of goes down as it burns. It's consistent. But things are different in a dream. The dream that you have last night will have nothing to do with the dream the night before, and nothing to do with the dream the night before that. And there's no consistency. And so if you're Descartes, and you find yourself writing the meditations, and you find that the candle starts appearing and disappearing, and your writing goes from one place to the other, and there's no consistency to it, that's an indication that you're in a dream. And so the fact that Descartes is writing the meditations, and there is consistency in the sense that as he's writing it, the ink goes on the page line by line, Descartes knows that he is awake. And that is a summary of the philosophy of Descartes. The big ideas are that your mind is separate from your body, and also that you can trust your reason and not your experience. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do exactly what Descartes would have wanted, and I'm going to doubt Descartes. Now, these are philosophical issues where reasonable people can disagree. Nevertheless, I'm going to give my take. I'm going to start by saying what he got wrong, and then I'm going to say what he got right. Well, one thing that Descartes got wrong, in my opinion, is that his arguments are contingent upon the existence of God. Now, he has some arguments for the existence of God. However, these arguments were not accepted by the philosophers and the theologians at the time who believed in God. If I give you an argument with a conclusion that you agree with, but you disagree with my argument, it's probably not a very strong argument. So there are some problems with this argument for perfection. It's not obvious that a perfect thing always causes a less perfect thing. It's certainly the case through the history of the evolution of life on Earth that things can become more and more complicated over time. And it's also not obvious that if you have doubt, that doubt is less perfect than knowing. Descartes hasn't proved that to be the case. Descartes certainly believes in doubt very much. And Descartes also says the idea of God proves the existence of God. Well, first of all, it's not necessarily the case that just because you have an idea of something, it means that that thing exists. Also, Descartes says that the idea of God is innate in everyone's mind. The idea of God. Now, a God that is all-knowing and all-powerful and all-good. Well, not every culture has that idea of God. Many different cultures have a lot of different gods. For example, the ancient Greeks we were talking about before, they believed in many gods. They were polytheists. As well as that, you can believe in God. Maybe you believe in God, maybe you don't. However, a logical argument is only valid if its premises are valid. If the premises are based on belief, then your conclusions are going to be based on belief. And so if you get rid of belief in God, then you can't trust any of the conclusions. Now, the reason I'm talking so much about Descartes' argument for the existence of God is because it's the basis of all of his philosophy. It's central to the whole philosophy. Because Descartes' philosophy says, I have intuition. I trust my intuition because of God, and also God is proven by my intuition. That's a circular argument. That's a circular argument. It's an argument which only works if you already believe in the argument. And therefore all the consequences of that, about the mind being different from the body, all of that fall apart. And this argument is so well known as a circular argument, it's actually remembered by philosophers as Descartes' circle. One thing that I can tell you about in terms of whether Descartes was right and wrong, one thing I can tell you about in terms of psychology is about the difference between the mind and the body. So Descartes makes the claim that the mind and the body are two separate things. And one claim he makes is that the mind is indivisible, that the mind can't be split into different parts. And we know from modern brain science that that clearly isn't the case. That if someone has a lesion to a brain region called the amygdala, damage to the amygdala, means they can't feel new fears. So you can get rid of or damage that part of the mind, let's say. Or if someone has damage to their insula, it impairs their ability to feel disgust. And so you can damage that part of their mind without affecting other parts of the mind. And so it seems that both the mind and the body are made of different parts. The strongest argument against dualism, that the mind and the body are different things, the strongest argument against is that it is clearly the case that changing your body can affect your mind. You know this. You know this if you've not eaten enough, and it affects your ability to concentrate. In terms of psychological studies, like I said before, we have lesioning studies, or studies of brain damage, in which if someone's brain, which is part of their body, is affected, is damaged, it also affects their mind. The classic example, the cliche example you always hear, is Phineas Gage. He was a railway worker who had damage to his prefrontal cortex, which affected his inhibition. So you could imagine that when that part of his brain was damaged, it also affected his mind. Another physical thing that affects your mind are recreational drugs, chemicals, alcohol and cocaine and so on, and also medications. If the mind and the body were completely separate, then antidepressants wouldn't work. Then antipsychotics wouldn't work. And so we have clear evidence that your mind can actually be affected by your body. The next limitation of Descartes, he's limiting himself very strictly to reason. Well, he says reason, but what he really means is deduction from intuition. But how do you know that the intuition is true in the first place? Here's one way that you can think about deduction, reason and deduction, knowing C from A and B. You could imagine that if you're playing a game of Monopoly, and you know all the rules of Monopoly, you can work out the best strategy for your next turn. If you're playing the game of chess, if you know the rules of chess, you can work out the best strategy for your next move in chess. And the same with all manner of games. But that doesn't mean that those rules are real. It's a valid argument if A and B are true, C is true. It's a valid argument, it's logical, but it's not necessarily true. Just because from the rules of chess I can work out the next best move doesn't mean that the rules of chess are the rules of the real world. And so, if you're limiting yourself to deduction, what you're really doing is you're playing a game where you work out, if this is true, then I can work out that something else is true. But it doesn't tell you anything about the real world. Let's go to the example of the triangle. Descartes said that we know that all triangles have two right angles, that the amount of degrees in a triangle is equivalent to two right angles. And he says this is self-evidently true. In fact, I gave the proof of that before. The problem is, that isn't always true. Not every triangle has 180 degrees. You might hear that and you might think that makes no sense, but I'll give you an example. If you start at the North Pole and you project a line down from the North Pole to the equator, and then you move a right angle, 90 degrees, and you project another line down to the equator, and then both of those lines meet up, so we've made a triangle from the North Pole to those 2 points on the equator, this triangle will have three right angles, 270 degrees. And so what's happening here is that you can actually have a situation in which you take three left turns and end up in the same place that you were before. It works because a triangle is only 180 degrees if the world is flat. If it's round, you can have more degrees. You could imagine that there's an infinite number of shapes on which you can draw the triangle, and for each of those infinite number of shapes, there is a different geometry. There's an infinite number of geometries. And so what Descartes is talking about the truth of mathematics It's not true of the world, it's just the rules of the game. Now, what you can do, if you want to find out which rules of the games are actually true, is you can use a combination of reason and evidence. Use evidence and use your reason to find out if the idea doesn't match the evidence. If you want to know more about that, you can look at my videos about the philosophy of science of Karl Popper. If you're going to limit yourself to deduction, that's not going to tell you anything about the world. It's just going to tell you the logical consequences of some assumption that may or may not be true. So that's what Descartes gets wrong, at least in my opinion. I'm going to tell you now what Descartes gets right. What Descartes gets right is his method. So the method that he's been using is start with your intuition, start with something which is obvious, self-evident, and then deduce things from that. And within this, doubt, rejecting ideas based on authority, within that is the basis of modern philosophy and modern science. Science is based on disrespect for authority. Science and philosophy are both based on the idea that I'm not going to listen to someone just because they have letters after their name. I'm going to think through it and I'm going to test it myself. If there's anything that Descartes got wrong, at least in my opinion, is that it's not that his method was wrong, his method of questioning things and use of deduction. That's not where he was wrong. In my opinion, where he was wrong is that he didn't sufficiently stick to his own method. Because the thing about Descartes is that he wants to find things with certainty, rejecting the conventional wisdom. But then he ends up agreeing with the conventional wisdom. He ends up believing that there are fixed stars which don't move. He ends up believing that depression is caused by an excess of black bile. Like the ancient Romans told us. He ends up believing that the nervous system is a set of cords pulled by the brain. He doesn't question religious belief. Now, you could make the case that the reason why he's making religious arguments is because he doesn't want to be censured and he doesn't want his books to be banned. Nevertheless, what you see with Descartes is you see someone who is doubting things all the time and yet comes up with the conclusions that were already around him. And if anything, that's an argument for empiricism, because the conclusions he reaches are the conclusions that he has received from the culture around him. Belief in God and fixed stars and black bars, all of these things that he ends up believing in are the things that he's learned from his culture through experience. And so when I read Descartes, it's almost as if you're watching someone who has convinced themselves that they are awake, although they are still sleeping. If there's one thing to learn from it, it's that you should not listen to Descartes. And you shouldn't listen to me when I talk about Descartes. What you should do is you should read through it and you should listen to the arguments and also to the arguments of other philosophers like Hume and like Kant, and work through the reasoning yourself and go through the evidence yourself.